Welcome everybody to a public meeting on a rezone. I'm Pat Hogan. I'm the chair of the Economic Development Committee of the Common Council. I'm joined by Councilor Paniagua, Councilor Majot, Councilor Manto, and Councilor Schultz. Just some procedural things here. This is a public meeting of the Common Council. This is not a public hearing. We will have public hearings on this. The Planning Commission will schedule one at some point. We're here to consider the legislation that will drastically transform the city of Syracuse, we imagine. After 56 years, when Owen started this, he had no gray in his hair, and I actually had hair. So it's been a long time, and I appreciate the efforts of everybody in the city administration and the various common councils, actually, that have served here to try to get this through. So I am going to turn this over to Mr. Carney, and you're going to give us a little presentation, correct? Okay, thank you.
Thanks, councilors. Councilor Hogan, appreciate the opportunity. As Councilor Hogan said, I should begin. Owen Kearney with the City Planning Division. I've been working on the rezone project for years, and we're here today. I'm here with colleagues from City Planning Division, Zoning Office, City Law Department, Neighborhood and Business Development, and we have been collectively working towards this day to present an overview before this legislation is formally before you, and I'll talk a little bit about that schedule towards the end of the meeting. But just to give you an overview of where we are, what are the changes that we have proposed that will be forwarded to you, and I think many of them are a result of really positive public engagement with the councilors during the recent seeker process. So, as you know, before I get into the agenda, or maybe there's the meeting agenda, just an overview of our project, a summary of those revisions, what are the changes, we'll highlight those section by section, identification of next steps, kind of what the schedule looks like over the next 60 days, and obviously question and answers with all of you. So with that, before we go to the next slide, we had started working on this project essentially in 2016. In 2019, after multiple revisions, multiple drafts, close to 100 public meetings, we posted and presented a final draft version of the ordinance and the map in 2019. We began the New York State Seeker Review, the State Environmental Quality Review at that time, and got about a third of the way through, and the pandemic started, and we essentially paused at that point. We restarted that process in 2021, completed it late last year in 2022, and what is being presented today is a final version with revisions to both the ordinance, primarily the ordinance and the map, that have taken into account that environmental review. And what that means is the changes that we're going to talk through today, many of them are probably generally familiar to you, probably familiar to many of the people in the room, but they are improvements from that 2019 version. We went through a rigorous environmental review. We identified things that needed some work, and we outlined how we proposed to change them in that final generic environmental impact that we completed in December. And since then, we've been making the revisions based on that. So what we're presenting today is similar to that 2019 version, but with many improvements. Things to help improve environmental conditions, social conditions, everything that was land use and otherwise that was addressed in seeker. That is what has motivated the changes, and with that, we'll start talking through what those changes are. Just a point of clarification, the two documents that we have recently posted online and that will come to you as formal, to be formally reviewed and adopted, are both the zoning ordinance and the zoning map. The ordinance is the text, the map is the application of those zoning districts throughout the city.
Just to clarify, the council just received the final revisions last night.
That is correct.
So a lot of us, we've gone through it before and all that, but we're aware. And I wanted to also say that the difference between a public meeting and a public hearing, this public meeting will just be for questions from the councilors to the city staff. The public hearing later on will be The public hearings later on will be for the citizens to weigh in on this. But as I said before, we just got this.
Understood. This was posted late last night. It's on the city's website for obviously anybody to review. We forwarded that link to councilors last night. Obviously not a lot of time to review a 250-page document. But the purpose of this meeting is, as you review that, as you get calls from constituents, as you review that over the next 2 or 3 weeks, hopefully this presentation will provide a little bit of an overview, answer some questions that you may have, and as you're looking at this tomorrow night or next weekend, you'll say, oh yeah, these are some of the things.
Anybody who wants to weigh in on this, please email any of the counselors.
Sure.
Or yourself to.
Yeah, and we can provide all that contact information, but it's exactly right. This is informational, provide an overview to you, and as Councilor Hogan said, we will have subsequent formal meetings, public hearings, both the City Planning Commission and the Common Council. So with that, those are the 2 items. Everything is posted on the city's website. The new Sear.gov website, Rezone, has a project page. Frankly, everything we've done is posted there. The new ordinance and the new map are posted there for public review. The goals of the project, you've seen this slide many times, but just to put a little context, our zoning, as Councilor Hogan mentioned, the last time it was comprehensively done was in the 60s. A lot of it was out of date, did not make sense for a growing city. And so we have focused, at the beginning of the project, we identified those 5 items as our project goals. We've met those goals, clearly met those goals in every instance. And while we're not going to talk about that in great detail, there is a presentation that really identifies how we met all those goals, but making it more accessible to the public, more user-friendly, updating and modernizing land uses and zoning districts. A lot has changed in 50 years, and the zoning needed to change with it. Design standards have been developed. They're citywide, thinking about lighting, thinking about site and building design, parking design, signage, all of those things are now in the ordinance, and they apply citywide. And finally, how do we improve the development review process, which has arguably been one of the biggest discussion items really over the past couple of weeks. How do we improve our processes? So that was our goals, and we'll talk up next. We'll begin getting into the revisions. What have we changed? As people look at this, the posted ordinance over the next week or 2, what have we changed? As I mentioned earlier, the revisions that were made were guided by that New York State seeker review, which we completed and you all authorized in December. And essentially December and January, we made those revisions to the ordinance. And we've tracked those and identified those changes via what's broadly called a track changes version. You'll see strike-throughs, new material is highlighted in a different colored text. It should be easy for a user to identify what's new. I should mention, and all of the substantive changes that we made are in there. They're clear, and happy to talk through any of them in detail. Additional changes were made to page numbers, some formatting, reference, essentially minor formatting items. Those are not called out. The page, anybody that's worked with track changes becomes pretty busy when you start doing some of the formatting. So those more insignificant or at least non-substantive changes are not included in the document. So all substantive changes are in there and should be easy for you to identify. Again, there's 7 articles of the zoning ordinance, essentially 7 chapters. I'm going to walk through these briefly, just to identify what the changes to each of these articles are. The first one, just general provisions of the zoning ordinance. Really, the only change we made here, as I note on the bottom, there's really limited substantive changes to this section or this article. We have made some changes to clarify nonconformities. And for those, just for the benefit of the room, nonconformities are lawful uses, site features or buildings that just don't comply with the current zoning. They could have been established before the zoning. There's a grocery store over on the east side that fits that bill. There's a bar in Eastwood that fits that bill. There's restaurants and a hair salon on the south side. Basically uses that are frequently non-residential uses situated in a residential district. Those aren't things that we generally are promoting, but we know they're here, and we want to make it easier for them to continue to operate and become compliant with the new zoning ordinance. So not shutting those places down. They're frequently places that neighborhoods love and take pride in their neighborhood, but they're also things that are a little bit incongruent with the zoning ordinance. So the nonconformities changes help improve that. How do we allow these legal nonconforming uses to continue, but to also become compliant with the new zoning ordinance? So that's really the primary change in Article 1. And moving to Article 2, more significant changes here. Article 2, for those that are familiar, is the section where all the zoning districts, all the residential districts, R1 through R5, mixed use, commercial, industrial, that's where all of those districts and their associated use standards are in Article 2. We've updated quite a bit, and obviously that page isn't entirely clear, but you can see some of the red text, the blue text that identifies changes that we have made. One of the big things, and we'll talk about this shortly, are we've made a lot of changes to housing. Affordable housing regulations, the allowance of accessory dwelling units in all of our residential zoning districts, attached housing, so thinking about housing types, housing choice, housing affordability, all of those things that I think we have pretty broad support for have to be included and are included in this new zoning ordinance, and the zoning districts reflect that. The additional standards that we've adjusted, and you can see that on the bottom, setbacks, stories, number of building stories have been changed in some instances, and lot coverage. One of the things that we have done with the creation of affordable housing allowed greater flexibility to induce that, to encourage that use in our community, which we know is so important. We've allowed some greater flexibility in these standards for applicants, developers, interested parties who are trying to establish that in the community, essentially incentivize that through some of these standards.
So, just to not to interrupt you, but the
Yeah,
10% of any project will have to have affordable housing, correct?
That is correct.
In order to incentivize people to do it, will allow them to build higher in order for them to basically afford it.
That is true. In certain districts, we are allowing that. That's exactly right. Specifically, the MX2 district, many of our neighborhood business districts, Butternut Street, Westcott Street, South Avenue, parts of South Salina, one additional story allowance is granted for mixed income housing.
Many of the developers I know feel comfortable with doing the 10%, and especially they love the allowance of building higher in order to sort of like offset the cost.
That's right. Understanding that to sometimes make that work, more units have to be prepared. I will note, and you'll see this in the use standards for mixed income development, essentially the affordable housing, up to 75, the establishment of 20 to 75 housing units. 20 is the threshold, Counselor, as I think most of you are aware. 20 and greater, whether you're rehabilitating an existing building or building a new building, anything 20 units or greater must comply with the 10%. Once you get over 75 units, so if you're proposing 125, 175 units, we've established that that's 12%. So it's 10 and 12%. Essentially, as you establish more units, there is a slight 2% increase in the requirement. That's in there, but I just wanted to call that out.
Are other municipalities around here, they do that currently, and how does that look, and how long have they been doing it?
I'm looking at my housing advocacy partners here. Not a whole lot of upstate cities have established this. This is common, the identification and requirement to establish affordable housing nationwide is a pretty common practice and decades old. It's not so much used in upstate housing markets, I think largely because most of those housing markets are compared nationally are fairly weak, frequently considered affordable, at least for many years. I think we know that quality affordable housing is not abundant in the city, and this regulation is meant to not only encourage that, but in this case, require it for larger projects.
I mean, actually, Syracuse is in a very unique position because we used to have a population around 230,000. So we have the infrastructure
Yes.
for that. And combine that with the governor's 1% suggestion, where the cities across the country, the state would have to like increase housing by
Right.
1%.
Right.
You know, I think we're right in line with this as far as we need housing for all levels of people, of folks. Low income, moderate, workforce.
Yep,
America.
and that's exactly what our focus is. We know, as you said, Counselor, at the national level, at the state level, there's movement on this. We want to be in front of that at the local level. So I think that maybe to close the loop, we are unique in this region, in central New York, with these new regulations, but we feel there's broad support from both, obviously, the public, from housing advocacy groups, and the development community, too. Counselor.
Oh, and how do you enforce that? I know with planning commission and all that.
Sure.
How do you go further to make sure that 10% to 12% is actually happening beside the lip service? So
That'll be through, we'll work with, and we've had quite a few discussions with the city's Department of Neighborhood and Business Development, who currently enforce a variety of housing programs, administer housing programs, verify occupancy and income requirements, and so we will be working with them really on the administration of that program.
So from the design to when it's finished, there's verification to make sure that.
Yeah, the design building design is largely here in rezone. The administration, the units are built, they have their occupancy permits, and all right, how do we make sure out of those 100 units, 12 of them are set aside for affordable individuals or families? That will be something that, again, the city will do, and largely the city's neighborhood and business development will lead that certification with applicants.
And actually, Counselor, any benefits that they request from the city through CITA, that will be a binding agreement that they'll have to fulfill as part of that, so.
Yeah. So that arguably is one of the, broadly speaking, these housing changes, or if someone were to ask what are the biggest changes to rezone, I think it's largely focused on these housing changes: greater housing choice, affordable housing requirements and incentives, housing types, and we'll talk about that on the next few slides.
I mentioned we're joined by President Hudson.
Owen,
Thank you, President.
have we reduced the setback requirements enough to make lots that are non-buildable now actually become buildable?
We have built in greater flexibility with the setback to establish setbacks, some smaller lot size where we have we've built in greater flexibility for non-conforming lots. We know we have some small vacant lots that have for years, that's not big enough. Some of them probably genuinely aren't big enough, but there are ones that are, I think objectively you could build a smaller home on. We have built in greater flexibility in both setbacks and lot size requirements to do just that. And I should mention, specifically called out the establishment or the construction of attached homes, row homes, common wall, townhomes, whatever you call it, is a very common housing type. It is many times a more affordable than a single-family housing type, and specifically allowing them really throughout a residential zoning district. That's also new here, and those can be established on smaller lots.
So Owen, sorry,
Yes.
as land bank tear down houses, right, and sometimes leaving this vacant space,
Yep.
in which the way we have dealt with it is sometimes we sell it to the neighbor to maybe expand their yard and stuff like that. Is there any provision in here to kind of see that? Because as housing is getting older, there's probably going to be possibility of tearing down more. Is there a provision in there to kind of reconfigure what to do with that land space and how to do that, or is it just as is?
Counselor, in many cases, the land bank works with Mr. Collins's and the Department of Housing in order to like acquire space through the demolishing old beat-up housing and acquiring that property for new housing, like we're doing right down on Delaware and Gray Street right now on the near west side. You know, that's part of the sort of the plan.
That's correct. And in addition to those additional housing types, smaller units that could be established on smaller lots. So we are providing greater options than are currently available to the land bank and land bank partners to build on some of those essentially non-conforming lots right now. So to answer your question, yes. Sticking with, if you could just go back one slide, Allison. Sticking with zoning districts, again, we talked about updating the purpose statements. Again, as simple as many of these districts now include the establishment of accessory dwelling units. That second accessory unit, that is now permitted in all zoning districts, in all residential zoning districts, and we called that out in the purpose statement. Next slide. Use regulation and development standards. We have updated the use table, again, including some of those new housing types, adjusted some other already established uses, allowing banking institutions, educational institutions in greater zoning districts, essentially making it easier to establish a variety of uses in our mixed-use districts, but also in some cases in our residential districts. So you'll see updates to that. Those are all called out on that table.
Well, let me ask you one
Yes.
question before you move on. You said intermixed and residential. There's certain parts of the city that you can't do intermixed. They're all residential, like
That's
on
true.
Leon. So that would stay the same way.
That is correct. There are residential zoning districts where we're not introducing any sort of residential districts that we are not allowing additional non-residential uses, personal services, retail, commercial, anything like that. But even in those residential districts that we would broadly think, hey, this whole block is solidly residential and has been for 100 years, we are allowing greater housing types. We're allowing things like those accessory dwelling units. So a greater number of residential uses than is currently allowed on that block. But you're right, we're not going beyond that to allow small commercial uses or things like that. That's correct, Counselor. Just to finish out this slide, we've also made adjustments to the use-specific standards, and I think that's important. That's really kind of where it calls out some of the details of what you can do. For instance, and this has come up quite a few times over the past few months, an accessory dwelling unit, meaning that secondary unit in a residential district, that can only be established in a single-family house. So if you have a two-family, you cannot establish an accessory dwelling unit. It's for single household units only. You can establish that second accessory dwelling unit. The accessory dwelling units have to be owner-occupied. So the owner of that property must live in the accessory dwelling unit or the primary structure. These are use-specific standards. The establishment of live music, if you're within, you're hosting live music, outdoor entertainment, if you're within 300 feet of a residential district, you must apply for a special permit. So within some of the many uses we identify, there are some specific standards, and those are in that use-specific standards section.
Can you go back to what you just said about applying for the permit, 300 feet? Music,
Yes.
you said?
Correct. Live music, amplified music.
So does this apply to our city parks?
This would be, that's a good question, Counselor.
Ordinance with like time limits, like you can't go beyond 9 o'clock or something.
So,
These ordinances 24 hours a day.
well, those are typically temporary uses. So this would be focused on, a temporary use is, downtown, a festival. We know there's loud music, we know there's residential uses within 300 feet. Those do not require a special permit, they're a temporary use. Uses that are established permanently, a restaurant that has a stage, a bar, a nightclub, those types of uses, if you have amplified music, live music, DJs, whatever, and you're within 300 feet of a residential district, that requires a special permit, which, as you know, Council, requires a public hearing. So again, just kind of what we think is a common sense set of standards for some of these specific uses.
So are current establishments going to be quote-unquote grandfathered in, or is every
Yes,
entertainment venue
yeah,
have to now
basically,
apply?
when this becomes effective, it's moving forward. It's not a retroactive, everybody has to come into compliance with it. It's as the city changes, as people establish an accessory dwelling unit, as a new restaurant's opened on James Street, as a hair salon's opened on Westcott Street, those have to comply with the new uses. So zoning in general is not retroactive. It is establishing these new standards, uses, and going forward, property owners would have to comply with it.
So back to the ADU, in essence, you can convert your garage to a house. Is that what it means?
That you can convert. You can either convert a garage. You can build new. We do have standards relative to that. It's a maximum again of 1 unit. It's not like you can convert the garage into a 3 unit.
Does that mean 1 bed? What's 1 unit mean? Bedrooms?
I'll have to look at the standards, but I think it's essentially, I believe it's 1 bedroom, kitchen, bath that can be established. The idea is that these are smaller units. They're affordable units. They're frequently the most, Councilor Hogan actually sent me some literature on this recently. Typically, young people and elderly folks are commonly the folks that benefit from this affordable housing option. And Councilor,
Actually, in other cities where the cost of living is a lot higher than it is in Syracuse, it's become a place where people who lived in maybe one house for a long time, they sort of like work out a deal with their kids move into the big house, they move into the small house,
Sure.
and then they provide support for each other. It actually keeps families together. That's what's been happening in a lot of larger cities.
And to your point directly, the establishment of any new dwelling unit, whether it's in an apartment building, a new house, or an accessory dwelling unit, must comply with all the health and safety standards. So that would be a robust, permitting review, zoning review. But again, it's another option that that will essentially be allowed throughout the city.
They have separate water lines.
That's correct.
sanitation, all that stuff. So
Okay, one other quick question
Sure.
related to that. Can I then convert my garage into a 1 unit and Airbnb it if I live in my main house?
The city doesn't currently have regulations relative to short-term rentals.
Right, so that means we can, right?
I think that would, I don't often use that's a case-by-case basis, but yes, I would imagine that is something that could be possible.
I just want to mention, I noticed in the legislation, and I commend everybody on this, it seems like whoever's going to be the zoning administrator is going to have some flexibility and is going to have to, can be nimble.
Yeah.
Before, and I've been doing this a long time, and I've advocated for citizens a long time. A lot of times when a zoning administrator is inflexible,
Yeah.
that's where we run into issues.
Agreed.
Because there are things that come up that you can't really write down in legislation.
Agreed.
I respect that, but to me, that's a little bit scary and sticky because then we have interpretation up to the zoning administrator, and it's not a fair and equitable process depending on who you are and what mood I'm in as the administrator is what's going to be ruled on.
Challenge that it's not a fair and equitable process because it'll be pretty fairly transparent process, but also I think that a lot of times you can't write down every conceivable piece of legislation that might arise from the circumstance in the neighborhood.
I also think if we're looking at a city that we are promoting density, we're short-sighted if we don't think that it's a good idea for us to try to keep our elderly parents inside of our homes, right? So they are not surviving on Social Security alone. So if you can keep your mother out of a nursing home, and I won't name any of them, and keep them in an in-law apartment, that makes sense in a city that's trying to grow. Councilor Hogan said we have room for 80,000 more people, the infrastructure. My mom lives next door to me, for good or bad, she would say good. But there is something to be said for a family unit staying together, and I think I'm all for that. But Councilor Schultz has a point. We don't want these houses in these neighborhoods to become Airbnbs. I don't think that's going to happen. I think it's more likely that what Councilor Hogan said, younger kids are moving into the bigger house and giving their parents an apartment. So,
And as far as Airbnbs, I know I have 3 in my neighborhood,
I have
probably
lots.
within walking distance, and they don't bother anybody. I think maybe down the road, we might have to write some legislation
Yep.
for it, to maybe have Jake enforce something else he's got to enforce.
Poor Jake. We love you, Jake.
Another
Hey,
thing for you to do.
Can you
Jake.
clone yourself, Jake?
Agreed.
It's going to be, it's sort of a difficult, I'm not in favor of writing legislation, just to write legislation when we can't enforce.
Right.
I think we're probably going to get into that a little later.
And to maybe put a bow around it, there is a desire by the city to seek out greater regulations for short-term rental. That's not part of rezone, but that is an important issue. I will remind you, that's where one of the use standards does require that those that have an accessory dwelling unit, that it be owner occupied, either in the accessory or in the main house. So, which will work well for families, but an Airbnb situation or a VBRO or short-term rental situation, that owner is going to be on site. So, not that resolves all issues, but
Throwing it out there.
yep,
Thank you.
that,
Although
good
it's
point.
being challenged in the federal court about the owner being on site.
Okay.
So,
Well, at least not with the current ADU. So,
And before you move
Ye-
on, I want
yes.
to go backwards to something you said, when you said that you have to apply for a special permit 300 feet.
within 300
Within
feet. yeah.
300 feet.
Correct.
So I had this arise last year, I believe. So does that mean that if Counselor Schultz is having a party in her backyard, no? It
No.
doesn't apply to her?
No, it is only for parties in your backyard, an event in a city park, a festival downtown. We know these are frequently loud, fun events that make a lot of noise, but they're temporary. They're typically 1 or 2 days. If you're having a 2-day party, I'd like to be invited to that, Council President. But our festivals,
might want to have at a party or
Definitely.
Airbnb.
oh, sure.
Definitely. As soon as my garage is converted, you're all
Right.
welcome.
All right. But those temporary uses are not required to get a special permit. But a nightclub, a bar, a restaurant that might have outdoor space, or even frankly indoor, in the case of a nightclub or something like that, it's going to be there, that are essentially going through the permit review. They would be required to get a special permit, have a public hearing. There would be opportunity for public testimony and notification to area residents. So the idea is that those uses, which particularly next to residential districts, can be problematic, that we're really taking a close look at how those are established and operated. So with that, I will move on to the next slide. Article 4 of 7, we're a little over halfway through here. We have amended the standards that made some relatively minor. There's not a significant amount of adjustments in Article 2, but design standards, development standards regulate the physical layout and design of building and site. And we've made some changes to parking regulations, signage, and lighting, again, based on the input that we received during the seeker review. Generally strengthened those elements of the design standards, but not radical new additions. The next two sections, Article 5 and Article 6, the administration, which is really all the procedures, and the historic preservation section is Article 6. We'll talk through them next. Administration and procedures. The chart you see there, one of the things we try to do, and again, in an effort to streamline our processes, is identify a series of common review procedures, whether you're getting a variance, a special permit, a site plan review. There's a standardized, right, to some extent now, there's different procedures for each one of them. We want to make it so, hey, the first steps of all of those procedures are the same. There's one place to find an application. There's an opportunity to talk to staff. The review, the submittal and the review process are going to be laid out and similar throughout these. And then the scheduling and notice of public hearings and review and decision may differ. Obviously, if you're going before the Common Council, that's one review. If you're going before the Board of Zoning Appeals for a variance, that's another. But to the extent we can streamline these common procedures we have, and we made some additional clarifications in the draft that's before you to do just that. again, continuing with that, some of the things that we've looked at, and that's a very detailed chart, but it will be very helpful for those looking to go through these processes, whether, again, it's a sign review, a minor site plan review. What is needed and who you must go before is all laid out on that chart. And again, I realize nobody in the room can review that. But what we have done, you'll see those bulleted items, clarified some site plan review procedures. The affected and exempt activities have also been clarified. We've added the sketch plan review. That is for site plans. Basically, the site and building design gets reviewed under site plan review. That's a statewide review process, and we're moving. That's what we've proposed to do, even in the 2019 version. One additional adjustment that we have made is adding a sketch plan. One thing we heard from the development community is by the time my plans get to the City Planning Commission, in most instances, it has to be totally finalized. I need floor plans, and again, largely thinking more development, floor plans, HVAC, landscaping. It's, many times it's a six-figure investment before they can get before the review body. We're saying, hey, let's make an opportunity for those folks to come in earlier in the process with a less of an initial investment to get some initial feedback. And the idea is that it's a sketch, and maybe not literally a sketch, but that it is a less requirements for that initial review. Easier, quicker. Many communities in the area do that, and we've heard a lot of positive feedback from the development and the design community about this additional measure. So that is something new.
And as we know, the Planning Commission's agenda is always jam-packed, but allowing the zoning administrator to make decisions that might keep some of those things that shouldn't be on the Planning Commission agenda off. Making a decision yourself.
Right. Yes.
I think that will help things out, and move the process along, because let the bigger projects go on the Planning Commission agenda.
That is correct, and there's a minor site plan review, which does not require a public hearing before the Planning Commission, and a major one that does. Right-sizing those reviews, smaller things can have a quicker administrative review, and I should note that what those thresholds are laid out in the ordinance. So to get to your point, Councilor Schultz, what is the flexibility? What are the limits? Those are quantitative limits that we've identified, numerical limits over this many units, over this side, it's in there. So that flexibility is granted, and I think there's a lot of people, including Councilor Hogan, that are supportive of that, but that flexibility also has some standards and some boundaries by which the zoning administrator must operate within.
Do you have the infrastructure within the department to implement those changes?
Yes.
Like bodies to?
Yes. Yes. We do. And we will continue to, I should mention all of this is new. I mean, obviously, we currently do special permit reviews, and we currently do variance reviews, but there are new procedures. So we're going to be working more closely, zoning, neighborhood and business development. We'll increase the proximity and the relationships between city departments to implement this, the code enforcement department, but we're excited and setting the stage to do that now. Next slide. I think that's everything there. Historic preservation. This is one that we have made a series of substantive changes that are outlined in the ordinance. And some of them are relatively small adjustments, but ones that we have heard a lot of support for, and a lot of comments during the seeker process and subsequent to the seeker process, that despite our initial efforts, there are still some terminology that's vague. There are some time limits that are excessive. There are some fees that are excessive. And so in this document, you'll see probably about 10 changes that have reduced review times, and much of this is focused on certificates of appropriateness, which is a fairly common review for a whole variety of structures, but frequently residential structures. I think that many of our residential property owners that are making significant renovations will have to go through. So deleted vague terms, updated the appeals process, adjusted timeframes. I'm looking at my notes, I had some additional, extended the approval timeframe from 1 year to 2 year, requiring the board membership of the Preservation Board to city residents. Much of this has been motivated by Councilor Schultz and some neighborhood advocates that are very interested in this matter. So we thought we had we made some great adjustments to it. We've even turned that up even more, and those edits are in the document. And I'd encourage folks that are interested in there to take a closer look at that.
Okay, if I could, please, and thank
go
you.
ahead, Councilor.
First, I want to applaud, obviously, your team. As Councilor Hogan said, there have been several councils that have worked on this as well. I want to applaud the mayor and his team, as well as the constituents who, as you just pointed out, have a real active interest in this, mainly because of their property values, their quality of life. But specifically to the mayor, his door has been wide open to the community, and, you know, we are so grateful for that. And as you mentioned, there have been significant changes made to the tune of pages and pages and pages of discussion. So again, I can't thank you enough, and the constituents are very grateful. But just to give the audience and the people watching just a teeny tiny bit of background, where this started was 60 years ago. Obviously, they said that's when the ordinance went into place. James Street mansions in the 50s were getting knocked down because people couldn't afford to live there as a single family as they once were. And then the city realized, oh my gosh, we've got to preserve our historic integrity. So that's when the local preserve districts were created. Sedgwick James Highland was the largest. And at that time, the board was established with 9 members. There was, I want to say scrutiny, but it's not the right word. The governing terms were fairly simple in my mind. Exterior only, structure, built structure, and landscape as far as it, you know, refers to where it is on the land. And in addition to that, there was also no application fees. And I know that, you know, times change and things get more costly, but where we are today with rezone, we have a reduced number of board members from 9 to 7. At the same time, the level of governance and scrutiny has, in my opinion, tripled or more. And so I'm wondering how that happens with less board members. We also don't have a board member that's a layman, if you will. They're all very specialized, which is important. But even a contractor, which I think is probably the most significant person to have on that, with staffing shortages, material costs, and also with lead paint and asbestos, we've come a long way with protecting our citizens about that. These old houses are riddled with that. So with this scrutiny, with those issues, I really think there needs to be a little bit better balance. And again, we've gone line by line with things, so I greatly appreciate that. But lastly, just to consider, when this was established, houses were 50 years old. We've come 60 years later. They're that much older. We know what happens when our bodies age. We get pretty needy. So please consider, Councilor Hogan, yes, he's the perfect. So anyway, I just want to put that out there. And if there's still any wiggle room to discuss some of those issues, I think it would really go far, and dare I say it would be perfect. But, you know, living in those properties, they are, you know, people's life worth is in those buildings. And so when they go to sell, you know, we don't want to see the neighborhood fall apart. And the mayor even said himself, look at your neighborhood. It's why it is because of the Historic Preservation Board. I don't necessarily agree with that entirely, but I do see the need to have guidance and standards. So
Agreed.
thank you.
In case anybody doesn't know, Councilor Schultz represents the historic Sedgwick area.
In case you didn't know, the largest historic district with nearly 300 homes, Sedgwick James Highland, First District. So proud and honored. Thank you.
And appreciate, Councilor, go ahead.
No, you go.
Appreciate those points, Councilor. I appreciate your acknowledgement. It's been a team effort. As you said, the mayor and the constituents have moved many of these things forward, and we're happy to report on that. And again, take a look. Folks that are in those districts are interested, happy to discuss in more detail, but many changes have been made through a lot of collaboration. So just in an effort to move, go ahead, Councilor.
I just want to get to the.
Yes, and we're real close. Go ahead, next slide. Definitions, very briefly, definitions were.
Wait, before you go back.
Okay.
Go back to that picture right
Okay.
there.
Your house.
Near my house. Because we have not had, I've been there 10 years. And because of the preservation we could not get our windows changed out.
Okay.
And we finally did, and I'm trying to understand what was the issue there?
I will have to get back to you on that. I don't know, but we can report back on that to the council, what that.
I appreciate it, because
With
they
that
were just windows.
Understood. We will follow up with Franklin Square windows.
And the most important thing I neglected to say, and I do want to put it on the record, is plantings were not part of the original ordinance,
Yeah.
and they are now part of the original ordinance, so that is still a
And-
major
and
number
we'll-
one issue.
Worth clarifying that the plantings, flowers, shrubs, trees, what you plant, where you plant them is not part of this. What we are broadly considering landscaping is not part and not the intention, and perhaps that's something we need to make a little bit more
do.
clear. Landscape features, walls, stairs,
Yep, and that
retaining
was in there,
walls,
right.
things should be more clear. So,
For sure.
point taken, I guess, again,
Excluding plants,
for the sake of
flowers.
being on the record,
Then
we'll
it's nearly
clarify
perfect.
that, but in talking with staff and talking with law, plantings aren't something that will be included in the
Did
presentation.
you hear that, big brother?
So-
Thank you.
Well, I'm glad that was settled, so, go on.
So again, moving forward, definitions, we updated definitions. Obviously, many of these new uses, mixed income housing, affordable housing units, we've revised some to become current with current case law, have been updated. Those are called out in obviously bright colors. This is at the last chapter of the ordinance. And again, the revisions will improve the clarity and consistency throughout. So that is the ordinance. If we can go to the next slide. Zoning map, very briefly. Speaking of great neighborhoods, there's another one. We have updated, made minor updates to the map, fairly limited updates to the map based on seeker. The map is posted online. We'll make sure we get a hard copy to the council office. I know that has been something in the past. I think former councilor Driscoll had one when he was in there. But the changes, again, have been limited to, again, another great neighborhood, South Salina Corridor, mixed-use zoning adjacent to 81. We've made some adjustments based on advocacy from that neighborhood during the seeker review process. We've made those changes. Some minor adjustments to mixed-use designations throughout the city based on, again, public input, and some of those medium and higher density residential. Real minimal map changes, but again, we can provide a hard copy, and for the benefit of the audience, that is also posted online. We've also clarified in the map key, we had renamed some of the districts consistent with those new district names. So just, again, some clerical changes. R1 was previously called single unit detached on the map. Well, we know we're going to start allowing attached housing also. So again, we've changed the name to single unit residential. Minor adjustments like that, but just something that wouldn't conflict with some of these new housing types we know we're allowing.
Two questions. Does that map have like a GIS that you can zoom, and actually see the name of the street?
Yes.
Okay. And then
Yes.
second question, where in this, if this, has the consideration for driveways? Because the first district, I'm extremely passionate about saving our driveways. They were built in the 1800s when they had horses.
Yes.
And then in the 60s, when this ordinance was installed, they didn't take into consideration that cars were eventually going to be getting smaller. So they're kicking them to the street, on-street parking, big problem. And as we go toward the future, we've got electric vehicles coming. And in order to charge those vehicles, they need to be in close proximity to your housing structure. So if you're 4 houses down and your car's dead in the morning because you couldn't park it in your driveway, so is that in here with loosening the restrictions for what is a certified driveway or a legal driveway?
We can clarify that. It sounds like, just to understand, you want greater flexibility, that a range of driveway sizes are allowed that would facilitate that on-site parking for things like electric cars.
If it looks like a driveway and acts like a driveway,
Right.
let it be a driveway.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me, Counselor, and I'll
Yeah, can we talk about that
follow up
after?
on that
Okay.
with some
I think
clarity.
that's, Counselor Schultz has got a good point there, when we talk about non-conforming uses and things like that.
That's exactly right.
Very flexible, realizing that some of these neighborhoods over the years weren't part of the city of Syracuse.
Yep.
like, Were part of the town of Geddes, for instance, on the
Yes.
west side.
Yep.
So there are a lot of things as far as right-of-ways and all that. So as long as we're, realize that, we want to make this as easy and comfortable for the citizens of the city.
And that's a great point, Councilor Hogan, that nonconformity, what we started with, allowing greater flexibility for nonconformities is exactly the issue you're talking about, and I can provide some greater clarity on that in the coming days here.
And when Counselor Monto moves Granny into the house, she's not going to want to walk down the street to get to her car. She's going to want to get out with her walker right there, right?
She's dead, so I have to dig her up to move her into the
Well,
house, but
Okay,
That's a whole
on that
other
note, we're going to
zoning.
transition
That's Article
to
10.
that's gonna be
the,
uncomfortable.
what I believe is the second to last slide, administrative manual. There's been a discussion recently about what all is included in there. We've got two more slides I'll move through quickly. The administrative manual is essentially a user's guide. It will include public review procedures. Hey, when the Common Council, the Planning Commission, the Board of Zoning Appeals, the Preservation Board holds a public hearing, what are the procedures? How can the public be engaged? These are opportunities. Where are you going to find agendas and schedules? How can you stream these? Just something that people say, hey, I don't necessarily need to know the zoning ordinance, but I'd love to know how to get better engaged. Things like that will be discussed in there. Board information, addresses, websites, all of that. Board, who's on the board members, all of that will be identified in the administrative manual. Income requirements for affordable housing. We talked about having a range that we're going to target. I think the general thought is about 80 to 100% AMI, basing that on HUD data for the city, but we know that changes annually. That's something that'll be included in there. One person household up to 6, 7, 8 person household. Those income limits change based on household size, and so that is again something that'll be in here. Public notification requirements. We're going to have greater public notification. If you're having a public hearing, special permit for that bar, restaurant with live music, or whatever other special use permit, providing on-site signage with information about for the public to review the application. Too often we heard during the process, hey, this thing happened down the street from me. I didn't know anything about it. They had a public hearing. I didn't, here they are building it. We're going to put more on-site signage so people are aware that what's happening in their neighborhood. And if they want to look it up, hey, that application will be online. Seeker information, the New York State Environmental Review, that information, again, which changes fairly regularly, links to that. And then all the zoning application and fees will also be in there. Fees are something that most applications that require a public hearing require public noticing. The fees will largely cover that public noticing. And I should mention the fees, and Councilor Schultz, I know we've talked about this. Fees, some of these things have to be approved by council. Fees are one item that to levy fees, I believe citywide departments, but surely zoning and planning must have that approved by council, and so those fees will come before you in the coming weeks, essentially right after adoption, to clarify that. So those are generally things that are going to be included in the administrative manual. Information for the public, things to help users, and also information that may change annually.
When are we
Council.
getting that administrative manual?
That will be, that is based on whatever ultimately gets approved on that.
We have to approve this before we see that?
That's correct, because what goes in here guides the administrative manual, right? The public noticing procedures. I mean, we're not including fees in here. We're not including board composition. All of that will be in the administrative manual, but we understand that that's going to have to come before we implement the zoning ordinance. So that'll be something that is essentially right after the adoption of the ordinance.
I highly recommend that we get a copy of that before. I don't really feel comfortable voting on this because you'll read any sentence in there, it'll say, see administrative manual for more information. I need that.
The administrative manual will
I
be
understand
based.
what you're saying it is, but without seeing it, I trust you, but I don't have a sense of specifically what that is.
Well, perhaps those items that are of concern to you, specifically, hey, this references the administrative manual, we can talk through what those, what goes into those sections, but.
I don't expect it to be 100%, like the fees, obviously the council has to approve, but can't there be a placeholder, insert fee, or whatever? You've got schedules of
So you just want like
plantings
a
and things.
framework that, what would be included in there?
Have you started grading it yet?
We have.
So just cut through this. You have a proposed administrative manual, correct?
We have
You're
a
waiting for the final approval of the rezone before you print the final administrative manual?
That's correct.
You'll work with the council on that.
That's
So,
correct.
abate council.
But I think it's important that, I mean, obviously, that can't be finalized until this is finalized.
It doesn't need to be final, it
Oh,
could be a
okay,
draft.
all
I
right.
mean, this is a draft, so, I'd like to see that. It goes hand in hand with it.
We'll work with you to do that. We can surely provide the framework. I think it's just important to realize that it'll essentially have to be a draft document. And I think it's also some of the procedures, staffing, things like that are still being developed might not be included in there, but
And I also know, we're cognizant here at the
Sure,
city council
okay.
regarding if we need to amend later, we'll amend. I know
Yeah.
the corporation council doesn't like hearing that, but we,
Sure.
we might consider that.
Final slide.
Just quick,
Yeah.
Owen, I don't know if this is, you're the right person for it. What about neighborhood design? So this is a design question. So say a neighborhood is all built to be ranch. Is there any provision in here that say you can't have a colonial in a ranch neighborhood, or is that?
No. The design standards we have really don't talk about style. So, essentially something, a traditional building style versus a contemporary building style. It does not regulate the style of building. So style of house, a ranch versus a contemporary house versus a Cape Cod versus a colonial, it does not regulate that.
Is there a reason why that didn't happen?
The city has a range of housing types, a range of building types, and we want to continue to encourage that. And frankly, that's a level of detail that, frankly, you really see that in smaller communities that have very detailed design regulations.
I think we can handle what we can handle, basically. Before we get on to the procedural thing, I know you
Yeah.
want to get into it, but there's, certain issues. I want to commend Councilor Manto. I notice we don't have anything about family, we have household.
Yes.
It's in the new thing, and I think that we finally migrated into the 21st century about
Agreed.
that, as far as the definition goes, and he advocates strongly for that. I do have an issue in the Corporation Council. I do have an issue with the 5 unrelated people as far as the housing unit. I believe it's something that we probably shouldn't have in there. I am not going to block this at all with the idea that I know it's very difficult to enforce. In fact, it's probably against the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution to try to enforce something like that. The 5 unrelated individuals, why everybody thinks this relates to the university, I worry about this impact in the New Americans community. Because many times folks from different cultures live together as a family. And I hate to see any kind of problems in the neighborhoods regarding that. So just having said that, maybe we'll have, I really think we should go into the procedural part as far as what's
Next steps. Appreciate that note, Counselor, and we have updated that consistent with current case law. There is some adjustments to that, but
And I know
point
there's
taken, your
process and all
right.
that. I just hate to see people from another culture having to go through an appeals process in order to stay in the place where they are.
Understood.
And not only that, I think Corporation Council will attest to this. We have spoken on this extensively in terms of wanting to be really cognizant of everybody that live in this city, and that, and I share an example where as Lost Boys, when we came here, we were all unrelated, but resettlement agencies got us into a building where we were sharing a 2-bedroom. There's 4 of us. A 3-bedroom, there's 6 of us. I even remember on Fayette Street, a 3-bedroom, there were 7 Lost Boys in there, and they were all unrelated. So in this sense, that with resettlement agencies, with foreigners, with foreign-born coming to this country, with different cultures, with different way of living, it does impact how we live in this city, and I think it need to be really scrutinized and looked at carefully. And Council Manto and everybody else here has been very, very vocal about that, and Corporation Council has been cooperative on making sure that everybody is heard, and these concerns are just not from councilors, these are constituents' concerns.
Agreed. Thank you, Councilor, and point taken.
I'll just say that actually it doesn't only impact the New American community, it impacts all of our communities.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Of course.
Agreed. Understood. Finally, our next steps. As we talked about, the seeker review was essentially completed late last year. The revisions that we talked about today and that are identified in the ordinance online were made in December and January. We have begun that review process with the City Planning Commission and the Common Council, CPC and CC. Our presentation today is really the first step, an informal step, but we felt a very important step to brief you on this. We have a scheduled presentation, very frankly similar presentation we're going to give to the city's planning commission on the evening of February 13th. That should be on the city's calendar for folks that are interested. And after that, and this is essentially simplified, but the city will petition the City Planning Commission to formally begin the review process and make recommendation to the Common Council. We expect that to be in late February or early March, and then with the assumption that you would receive that recommendation from the City Planning Commission in probably early March, and take the remainder of, at that point, it's your prerogative as to your review process, but that would go through your legislative process. And we hope to move forward with the adoption of rezone at that time and a subsequent effective date for the ordinance, prepare and finalize the administrative manual, and have everything ready to go shortly thereafter. It's just that easy.
So we still have the ability inside of this time frame, if there's language changes,
Yeah.
there's some, and I might as well just say it. So we do have some, we're using the word immoral in the sign.
Yes.
So I don't like that.
Yep.
And you can imagine why there is a half of this country, or we'll say less than that, but sees the rainbow flag as being immoral. So that word in that ordinance stuck out to me last night. I got a little queasiness in my stomach, but so we can change those words as we can go through this with kind of a fine tooth comb and look.
Change some of those words, as Council Manto says, we can't change large portions because that would trigger a secret review.
Right. I think in plain terms, you have time to review this. Councilor, I appreciate you've already dug into it. Changes that you or that you're hearing, City Law Department will review those. As you both just said, minor changes can be accomplished between now and essentially the legislative draft that's presented. Wholesale revisions that aren't consistent with our seeker review would essentially require us to restart that process, push us back. So we are focused on minor edits, and I will happily liaison with the law department and all of you to review those, and we'll get them done.
I really can't believe we're actually here.
I have a question.
We're on
I have
the
a question.
5-yard line. Oh, wait, maybe we're going to get thrown back to the 10-yard line here. Go on, Councilor Schultz.
Thank you, Councilor Hogan. The CPC presentation, is that a public hearing, or is that just simply from you to them?
That is a public meeting.
Same as this here
Yeah.
right now? Okay.
It's an informational meeting that will be open to the public, presumably, I believe, in this chamber. I think at 5:30 in the evening. The thought being that this is daytime, having something at the evening, a very similar presentation, if not the same presentation, and we'll go through and have a similar discussion with them.
They'll have a public hearing, though, the Planning Commission will, at some point.
No.
Correct? It's up to the Planning Commission if they want to hold a public. Well, if they don't, we will.
We definitely are.
Regardless of whether they do or they don't.
Okay.
Each board has its own option.
Well, you tell them our option is that they have one, and then, You know, if you just-
Thank you, Counselor
On the
Hogan.
evening of the 13th, it is an informational session just like this. It is an open meeting. It has or will be posted, and the public is welcome to come, but much like this meeting, it is not an open question period. It is a presentation.
Well, we all realize it's important to have a public hearing, so we'll either have one or they'll have.
And they also make a recommendation to the council on whether or not they approve or disapprove. Do they
So the
give
next
comments
meeting
or no?
is an informal meeting just like this. We will formally request that they review it under their formal authority, consistent with the charter. They make a formal recommendation to you, much like a special permit would start with them, and a recommendation comes to you. And then ultimately, you would go through your legislative process and deliberation, and ultimately make the final decision. Thank you. For anybody that's interested in more information, how to get in touch with me, all my contact information's on the city website. Happy to chat with people afterwards, but we appreciate your time, your advocacy, all the work you've done to help us get this to where it is, and look forward to really working with you over ostensibly the next 2 or 3 months to get this over the finish line.
Thank you, Owen. I appreciate the administration.
Good job.
Oh, my God, applause for rezoning. I never
Yeah,
thought I'd see
yeah.
that. It's like the Carson show.
Hey, whoop, whoop.
See if you get that at
Okay, I, move
the
to adjourn this.
sanitation meeting tonight.
Motion to adjourn.
Move.
Second.
Thank you.